political situation for the government.
The politics getting in the way once again. What about the politics around Huawei? We've talked in the past about the threat coming from China, and this administration has been very clear that Huawei infrastructure means back doors to all of our data back to the communist government. But there's Huawei in Canada.
Huawei is a big commercial provider in Canada, but let's be clear, certainly when we were in government, all of our national security experts agreed that deep penetration of Huawei into our systems, into government systems, into 5G networks would be an unequivocal threat to national security. I mean, we have to understand, Huawei is not a normal private company. It is an extension of the Chinese surveillance state. And, you know, there have to be limits. Any Western society that allows Huawei to go beyond certain limits that endanger national security is being extremely unwise. So I hope that ultimately our government will figure that out.
So how come, you know, what's with Canada having all of this Huawei commercial providers, you know, so permeating throughout the country, and what's with Europe that they've got this infrastructure of Huawei as well? Do our friends across the world not see Huawei the same way as the U.S. does?
Views differ country to country. I think one of the challenges is that Huawei has good products and is a low-cost provider, partly because of government subsidization. And also, Maria, I think the other thing is partly because the supply chain, there's not a kind of complete Western supply chain in this space. And I do think ultimately that the government of the United States is going to have to work with allies to make sure that there are Western providers of all of these, of all this equipment and services. Otherwise, the pull towards Huawei will get stronger and stronger.
This is a really important point, and this is a very significant threat. So we'll keep following that. Another threat is Iran. Voters are headed to the polls today in Iran. The contest seen as a test for President Hassan Rouhani's popularity amid this escalating political and economic tension throughout the country. Your reaction to that, and what should be done in terms of the threat from Iran?
Sure. Well, let's be very clear about what these elections do and don't mean. You will see in all kinds of other media outlets this assertion that this is somehow a battle between reformers and hardliners. They're all hardliners. You can't, unless you support the dictatorship of the Ayatollah, you cannot be a candidate in these elections. So really the only test here, how many turn out and is there really support for the regime? But there is no doubt that the maximum pressure policies of the Trump administration, combined with some of its recent actions, are putting Iran more and more in a corner. And, you know, look, I think they deserve congratulations for that.
And here, too, Europe is waffling once again. We got the, you know, the Europeans buying or wanting to buy oil and gas from Iran. You've got Chinese buying oil and gas from Iran. I think 70% of the exports out of Iran are going to China. And we've got this partnership with China, and the U.S. is putting sanctions on anybody who does business with Iran, and they're doing it no problem.
It's all extremely short-sighted on the part of all of these powers. The single most dangerous threat the world faces today is the Iranian regime getting nuclear weapons. And frankly, the entire world should be working with the Trump administration to bring as much pressure as is necessary to prevent that from happening.
Yeah, you would think. What are the threats that we need to be aware of today? I mean, we just talked about China, Iran, but from a country level, what do you see as the most important issues, not just the U.S., but Canada?
I think the single most important threat in the world today is nuclear proliferation. And the single most dangerous place in the world for potentially having nuclear weapons is not North Korea, in my judgment. North Korea is serious, but it is Iran. And it is Iran because you would have for the first time frankly, a theocratic regime that might not be afraid to use nuclear weapons. I mean, there's people in that regime believe if they start a nuclear war, Allah will come to their defense. And this would be the first time in history you'd have a government in the possession of nuclear weapons for the purpose of using nuclear weapons. And that is something the world cannot contemplate. And frankly, the JCPOA, the previous agreement, if you look at its provisions, it was a roadmap for Iran to have nuclear weapons in 10 years. So administration was right to get out of that, but obviously there needs to be a concerted strategy to really prevent this from happening.
Unbelievable. The president also released a Middle East peace plan recognizing Israeli settlements in the West Bank 6 years after Israeli-Palestinian talks collapsed in 2014. Your reaction to that?
Maria, this is inseparable from the Iranian issue. what the administration has really done there is brought together Israelis and many of the Arab states in a coalition. And what they're really saying is to the Palestinians, you know, stop your intransigence, go to the bargaining table, because frankly, we have a bigger problem to worry about, which is Iran. And, you know, this is really now the ball is in the Palestinians' courts. The Arabs have been clear. You know, basically, this is what it's going to look like unless the Palestinians engage. So it's up to them. In the meantime, Israel, the Arab states, are going to continue to work with the U.S. administration on fighting the Iranian threat.
So many important issues, Stephen, in terms of you know, China and the threats there, in terms of terrorism and the very dangerous situation happening in Iran and its proxies as well. And yet we see politics getting in the way. I mean, this administration has been talking about all of these threats, but the Congress has this resist movement on. Is that the same thing that you see in Canada right now, whereas you can't get anything done because of politics?
Well, it's a little bit of a different situation. You know, my party's in opposition. It's a minority government. I wouldn't say their resistance to the government is just politics. Fact of the matter is, government's pursuing a series of economic policies that are not good for the country. So in a parliamentary system, unlike your system, in a parliamentary system, all of these votes end up being confidence measures. So, you know, an opposition has to weigh. On the one hand, do we want to support the government? Maybe a good individual action, but if we support the government, we keep it in office. So what's the better choice? And, you know, that's a very different calculus in a parliamentary system. Here in the United States, there's, you know, Congress should be deciding these cases on their merits, because the administration is going to stay in office one way or the other until the election.
Yeah, and yet you've got real fights going on in terms of policy and in terms of very simple things like making sure that people understand the China threat, making sure that people understand the Iran threat. And yet you've got this resist movement here that they, for whatever reason, they don't like President Trump, so they resist.
Yeah, I think, you know, you've obviously got a dynamic here. You know, this is my observation as a foreigner, that the opposition to President Trump is so intense and so personal that the opponents are completely blinded as to what it is he is or is not doing, to the point where, you know, they're prepared to virtually side with the Iranians on some of these issues rather than support the administration. This is really crazy, but I think, Maria, my observation is this is why President Trump's possibility of re-election keeps rising.
And under your leadership in Canada, you had real economic growth. We're looking at real economic growth here as well, and yet a big portion of the country are saying, oh, well, maybe we'll try Bernie Sanders out and socialism reforms.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually incredible. I find this, you know, as somebody who's old enough to have lived through the Cold War, I find that somebody would propose socialism as an economic model today. It has literally failed in every single country it's been tried. We look at China, governed by the Communist Party, but no longer according to a communist economic model. Even they gave it up. And yet you have someone in the most advanced country in the world undergoing an economic boom, proposing it, and he's leading the race for the party. But I think that's a testament to the degree to which the Democratic Party is out of touch.
But by the way, before you go, do you think President Xi Jinping's tenure could be challenged as a result of all of these things coming at him, coronavirus, the Hong Kong protesters, or dictator for life is dictator for life?
He's in a pretty powerful position. Yeah. But I think what this tells you, if you look at the coronavirus issue, what's the first instinct? The first instinct is to cover it up and deny it exists.
Lie.
And so everybody who says, what a brilliant system of political decision making, need to remember this is how dictatorships actually function. They try to deny problems and they try to cover up errors. And we make lots of mistakes in democracies, but democratic systems tend to be self-correct.
And by the way, in doing so, accelerated the problem. More people got the coronavirus as a result of the cover-up. Prime Minister Harper, it's good to see you.
Nice to see you.
Thanks so much. Stephen Harper.